The survival horror genre of video games is, to me, its most powerful. When the potential of a horror game is leveraged with skill, it can trigger a visceral flood of panic and dread for the player that can handily eclipse the emotions that other games elicit, at least in terms of intensity. This is not without risk, though. Taking a swing at a player's sense of stability and assuredness can just as easily end with an embarrassing faceplant if all the pieces don't perfectly fit. This is why so many corny horror movies and games from many decades ago are now enjoyed in more of a comedic sense by many. Where fear fails, comedy often takes over. Some games even lean into that. 2017's Friday the 13th is a great example of a game that scares you when it can, but is also fine with just being a goofy trip into absurdity when it can't. There is certainly a time and place for that, but the true giants of the genre are the games that aim for that microscopic bullseye and actually hit it. Resident Evil's mysterious mansion and the many secrets it holds keeps you in suspense of what could be waiting for you behind each and every door. Silent Hill 2's enigmatic characters slowly reveal the grim personal hell that all of their past traumas led them to create. These are two completely different styles of horror game, yet are still both sterling examples of the genre being done right. Another breed of horror classic also exists though, the transcendental horror masterpiece Clock Tower on the PlayStation 1. I feel the need to qualify it as Clock Tower PS1 because, unfortunately, Capcom decided to pull a Final Fantasy on us with this series by deciding to pretend like its Japanese prequel didn't exist in America. And if the internet had never been invented, they might have gotten away with it. The truth is, Clock Tower on the Super Famicom, the Japanese Super Nintendo, is actually the first game in the series. As somebody who has had the pleasure of actually playing through a translated version of it, I can also recommend it to my fellow horror hounds. But despite its various innovations and how far ahead of its time it really was, it was outclassed by its far more popular sequel in just about every measurable way. Clock Tower on the PS1 is a direct sequel to the original Japanese horror game. As such, it shares some characters, gameplay elements, and continues the storyline of it in a logical way. While playing Clock Tower PS1 is definitely enhanced by understanding the original, it was also created in such a way that it's not necessary at all to fully enjoy the PS1 game and grasp what it's trying to do. This is the first in a long list of things Clock Tower on the PS1 got right. A very important, yet often overlooked element of a great horror game is its cast of characters. These days, you generally don't see more than one or two main characters in a horror game. And while that can work out fine, Clock Tower gives you 6 main characters, or a few more depending on what your definition of a main character is. But their mere existence is not why the cast is impressive. They're all written so skillfully that their unique personalities and proclivities jump right off the screen and into your imagination. You'll often find yourself wondering what characters like Harris are actually up to, as they come off as a bit off. Even during sections without voice acting, which is most of the time, somehow their motivations and identities are instantly clear. Unless, of course, the game doesn't want them to be, in which case they're not, but that's sort of my point here. Even the less than perfect English voice acting can't get in the way of the outstanding writing and pacing of the game's events. You have Professor Barton, a rather cold-hearted criminal psychologist with an insatiable desire to understand everything about the Clock Tower murders, which eventually leads him to madness. Stan Gotts, a much more down-to-earth assistant inspector, which is just basically a detective in Norway, who has a very close friendship with Helen Maxwell, who is the guardian of Jennifer, the survivor from the first game. That's just scratching the surface of the cast, but rest assured, it's a well-rounded cast of surprisingly believable personalities, whose agendas intermingle in interesting ways throughout the game that quickly make you forget about the antiquated graphics you're looking at. It's important to have good characters for the longevity of a horror game. Once the initial novelty of a game's horror starts to inevitably wear thin, the motivations and mysteries surrounding the characters can help the horror stay afloat and remain believable all the way to the end. This is why horror games with a bland, uninteresting protagonist tend to lose much of their impact once the gameplay loop has been understood. A horror game is nothing, of course, without a threatening presence, something to generate the fear and perpetuate the narrative. In Clock Tower, the game makes no bones about it being the iconic Scissor Man. Not a horde of zombies, monsters, or failed bioexperiments, but just one guy, one relentless force that pursues his victims until one of them is stopped. This was unique for the time. Most horror games then, and even today, rely more on the tenets of the action genre with guns, ammo, and an endless supply of spooky baddies to blow away. There's nothing wrong with that style of horror, but to me, it's not truly horrifying unless you feel vulnerable, and that the only way to advance is by the skin of your teeth. The more secure you feel in your ability to dispatch threats, the less scary the experience will be. Maintaining that sense of uncertainty and unease is the key. Clock Tower understood this, perhaps more than any other horror game of its era. Instead of dressing up an action game to look scary and giving you less ammo and calling it a day, Clock Tower gives you no weapons at all. In fact, the only way to survive an encounter with Scissor Man is to use your environment to either hide or get a one-time hit on him with something like a lamp or a coat rack. If you're cornered with no options, you can roll the dice with Panic Mode, a short window of time where you can temporarily thwart Scissor Man if you manage to mash the square button enough times. But even that won't necessarily end the encounter. It merely gets you out of the room and gives you another chance to hide. This is a nearly perfect way to handle a horror game, and I'm surprised that it hasn't been more closely imitated by other games since. There are experiences out there like Remothered and Amnesia that do something similar, but it's still not quite the same. In those games, the villain is pacing around the environment in real time, causing you to need to sneak around them to achieve various objectives, like a stealth game. If you don't get caught, you don't generally get pursued outside of maybe a few scripted moments here and there. In Clock Tower, Scissor Man isn't actually roaming around in real time, he's hiding. There are moments where he'll suddenly start pursuing you unprovoked, but by that time he already knows where you are and it's time to hide. There's no sneaking around or relying on stealth mechanics. That important difference seems lost by most modern horror games. And that is another huge reason why Clock Tower remains a classic even by modern standards. Clock Tower also interestingly gives you breaks from the levels or scenarios where Scissor Man is involved, with short intermissions that focus on the story. Here, you go to different locations to talk with different characters and advance the story, decompressing from the last scenario and building up to the next. This was another genius idea. These sections only last a few minutes, but that oscillation between intermissions where you feel safe and scenarios where you're not create a rhythm that deliberately heats things up and cools things off, and prevents you from getting too familiar with either one. On top of that, the replayability is quite high in Clock Tower. Depending on what you choose at a handful of important moments, you can end up playing one of the two main heroines, Helen or Jennifer, and getting one of 5 of their separate endings. That's 10 total endings you can get, which are vaguely alluded to in hints that are scattered around the game, which you can also collect. From the endings, the hints, and a ton of random spooky things you can find or miss, the game is absolutely full of reasons to replay it multiple times. If you like Clock Tower, there is plenty of it here to play. Where most horror games start to lose that sense of dread by the middle or the end of their playtime, Clock Tower keeps it going by ratcheting up the complexity of the environments and the frequency of encounters with its main villain at a steady pace throughout. It even throws in some other unexplainable supernatural encounters that aren't necessarily Scissor Man's doing, as if to imply that everywhere he goes he brings different types of evil with him, like an inescapable cloud of demonic energy that we'll never quite understand. But most importantly, it exceeds at holding on to the fear all the way to the end. It consistently stays one step ahead of your mind, like a master criminal who can never be caught. If you are a fan of horror games at all, there is literally no good reason to not give Clock Tower a shot at getting under your skin. Odds are, it will. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed and would like to see more, feel free to hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to ensure you'll be notified when new videos go up.